Factions in the WWE seem to be the it thing at the moment. Everyone who's anyone seems to be part of a faction. But this recent focus on factions in WWE programming hasn't always been the case. In fact, there's been stretches of time where factions are kind of just forgotten. So today we're gonna go back in time and we're gonna look at the best faction for every single year for the past 20 years. As always, don't forget to subscribe to this channel, ring that bell for notifications. If you're a wrestling fan, I know you're gonna fall in love with this channel because we upload daily wrestling content. All right, let's jump into it. Starting off in 2002, I could have, I guess, gone with the NWO because they did make their WWE debut in 2002, but they were never really utilized as a proper faction in the WWE. So I forewent using the NWO for this and instead went with a more organic faction that was really over as a heel. They were absolutely crushing it. They got so much heat. I'm talking about the Un-Americans, the set of Canadians that would go around with a upside down American flag all over the United States chanting that America sucks. Yes, it was cheap heat, but it worked. And all three of these guys, Tess, Christian, and Lance Storm, were fantastic ring workers. The gem of this faction is easily Christian. We already know how great of a character worker Christian is, but to me, this was really his coming out party, demonstrating that he isn't just a member of Edge and Christian, that he can blossom as something else entirely. And I think that this was really his first start as a great character worker. And everyone hated them, so they were doing their job right. The Un-Americans. 2003 gave rise to one of the most famous WWE factions of all time, a faction that would go on to dominate WWE television for quite some time. So it starts off with Evolution in 2003, who had every single title at one point this year: World Heavyweight, Intercontinental, both tag titles. They were at the very, very top of the food chain. There was no one touching the likes of Evolution at this time. And they would hold on through this dominance all the way through 2004, eventually even with Randy Orton winning the World Heavyweight Championship. Yes, he'd get kicked out of the group halfway through 2004, but the group of Batista, Triple H, and Ric Flair, that alone was enough to continue to propel Evolution to be the top faction in 2004. I'm gonna be honest, they didn't have that much competition, but still, it doesn't change the fact that the names in this group is actually insane. The fact that Randy Orton and Batista would go on to become megastars in their own right. Triple H was at the height of his megastardom. Ric Flair had already been a megastar. This faction, it's actually kind of insane that it even exists. In 2005, I could have gone with Evolution because they did dominate the early portion of the year, with Batista winning that year's Royal Rumble and Triple H being the World Heavyweight Champion going all the way into WrestleMania. But that's the first quarter of the year. I would say that a more dominant faction throughout the entirety of the year at this time in 2005 would be JBL's cabinet. That was still intact even when JBL lost his WWE championship. This is a team that had a WWE champion and a United States champion as well. I didn't love them. This is kind of the fact that they didn't have too much competition aside from a dissolving Evolution at the start of the year. And what you're gonna notice is that from here on out, there is a very low emphasis on building factions in the WWE. They really start to go by the wayside here. But I like the formation of the cabinet because it was kind of done in a presidential executive office style. You had JBL, who was of course like the president. You had the chief of staff. You had the Ministry of Defense. I don't really remember the proper titles, but you know, at least it was kind of unique. And they had a really fun feud with John Cena throughout 2005. So I'm gonna give this one to the cabinet, even though I don't think they're that particularly amazing. 2006. Fellas, it was a rough year for factions in 2006. There's really not that much to go off of here. So I gave this to the Spirit Squad. If you can think of a better faction in 2006 than the Spirit Squad, I'm all ears in the comment section. But as I looked, as I did my research, as I thought back to my years watching wrestling, when I had to teleport myself back in 2006, there was no other faction that stood out more than the friggin' Spirit Squad. And look, their job was to be annoying. annoying, and they work. They were the most annoying thing on WWE television for the entirety of 2006. They were also in major profile situations with the likes of Triple H and with the likes of Shawn Michaels, and they were the lackeys of Vince McMahon. So they were on WWE television not every once in a while, like on like main event segments, opening segments, pay-per-views, all the time. Shout out to Dolph Ziggler, who survived this gimmick and ended up becoming the Dolph Ziggler that we all know and love today. But yeah, it's a rough time for factions in the WWE in 2006. They were not a focal point at this moment. This video is brought to you by patreon.com/SantiZap, where you're gonna get even more wrestling content than you're already getting here on this channel. You're gonna get the Wrestling is Cool podcast 3 days early. You're gonna get the Monday Night Raw reviews, the SmackDown reviews, the wrestling Q&As that we're doing over there, and more. So go check it out, patreon.com/SantiZap. There might be something that you like there. It'll be the top link in the description. All right, back to the video. 2007 doesn't really get much better. There are not too many options for factions that I would say really stood out in 2007. I guess I'll go with the ECW originals, because at the very least they had a unique story, as they were kind of like the last bastion of hope for ECW as the new breed of ECW WWE style started to take over. So as fans, we kind of understood and believed their motivations, the motivation of trying to preserve the ECW that everyone knew and loved, an ECW that was being bastardized and cannibalized by the WWE machine. Plus, I mean, it's a group of guys that are just easy to like, especially back in 2007. Tommy Dreamer, Rob Van Dam, Sabu, and the Sandman. Like, these are just cool dudes. But again, they weren't particularly treated like this top tier faction a la Evolution, and they weren't really truly this like super cohesive faction that would last the test of time. They were really just there for a couple of feuds and a couple of storylines in 2007, so they don't really have much to write home about, if I'm being honest with you here. And that's not necessarily me trying to shit on these guys, it's just the fact that there aren't that many factions to compare them to. They're kind of just here by default, sort of. 2008 saw again the rise of a fairly prominent faction, but a faction that annoyed the hell out of me. I did not like this faction, but it doesn't change the fact that they were at the top of the food chain, and they met every single one of the criterias for what a heel faction should be and how they get under people's skin. They had a really annoying mouthpiece. They had a really annoying world champion who would constantly win through shenanigans with his two lackeys. That goes to La Familia, that had Vicky Guerrero, Chavo Guerrero, the Edge heads being Kurt Hawkins and Zack Ryder, Edge, and sometimes Teddy Long. But this is why I'm just used to Roman Reigns winning the way that he's winning, because I feel like it was mastered by Edge during the time of the Edge heads and La Familia. But this is the faction that dominated SmackDown television, and they would go on to have very major marquee feuds and very major marquee matches, like the WrestleMania main event versus The Undertaker that year. But this isn't a faction that is celebrated with the test of time. It's just kind of gone by the wayside. They weren't ultimately that memorable when you compare it to some of the other factions that are about to pop up in the 2010s and in the 2020s. 2009 saw a great faction on paper, but in execution, I don't think that they're that great. That being Legacy, Randy Orton, Ted DiBiase Jr., and Cody Rhodes. The premise was simple. Every single one of these guys were a second or a third generation WWE superstar. Randy Orton's dad is Cowboy Bob Orton. Cody Rhodes' dad is Dusty Rhodes, and Ted DiBiase Jr.'s dad is the $1 Million Man. So all of them come from good stock. All of them are legacy. But the thing is, Ted DiBiase Jr. and Cody Rhodes are green as shit at this moment in their career. They're too green to be alongside somebody as in top in their game as they were as Randy Orton, especially bald Randy Orton. And because they were just so far beneath him, this didn't truly feel like a faction. It felt like the Randy Orton show and the two guys that would occasionally help Randy Orton. Hell, they would even break up the group with a triple threat match where Randy Orton would absolutely destroy these two. So even though Legacy on paper is a super cool idea for a faction, I think it was just executed perhaps maybe a little bit too early in these guys' careers. But hey, at the very least, they did something that the Shield never did, which was to give us a triple threat match at WrestleMania. We've been wanting that Shield match at WrestleMania, and we never got it. But we got it with Legacy, at least. 2010 did see the rise of a very prominent faction, a faction that I believe is highly overrated, but a lot of people do tend to love, and these guys have a soft spot in the hearts of many WWE fans that were around in the horrible year that was 2010, that being the Nexus. Look, the Nexus to me is just a bunch of jobbers that were given a really cool story at the very start of their main roster career. Because when I look at this group, I am not impressed in any way, shape, or form aside from Wade Barrett and Daniel Bryan. Daniel Bryan, who wouldn't really even be part of the faction. And sure, I guess it's fair to say that maybe it was booking that killed the opportunity for the rest of these guys to become stars, but I don't think that most of these guys had it in them to become stars. I know, I'm sorry. I know I'm being a little bit negative here, and I think that I'm in the minority on this one, but the Nexus never really did it for me. Still, it doesn't change the fact that they were groundbreaking and they created a lot of headlines with the way that they were booked. They were booked as renegades that came to destroy everything that the main roster was all about. They even got to destroy WWE's poster boy in John Cena. That is not something that happened lightly in 2010 when John Cena was at the hype of his Super Saiyan powers. Ultimately, as the months passed, I think that you could see the weakness in these guys' character work and in their in-ring abilities. Sure, it didn't help that they got booked to Kingdom Come to lose SummerSlam to Team WWE, but honestly, I think that that was the dagger to seal the fate of Nexus, but to seal a little bit quicker. I think ultimately it would have ended the same way. Still, I'm not gonna sugarcoat the fact that they were a really cool premise in 2010. In 2011, there's not really much to write home about yet. Like, we are still kind of in that Nexus era, but I would say I wouldn't give this to Nexus. I'd give this to the new Nexus, the Nexus that was led by CM Punk. Still, I'm not overly impressed by the people that are in this group, but it's cool to see CM Punk lead another group. Like, CM Punk just knows how to lead groups. He's just a very entertaining and charismatic leader. Some would say that he's a cult of personality. Hell, if it wasn't for Legacy and the very same Nexus in 2009 and 2010, I probably would have given faction of that year to the faction that he was leading at the time, the Straight Edge Society. More than anything, I just love the fact that the Nexus had a very talented mouthpiece now, something that it was kind of lacking during the Wade Barrett days. CM Punk just made this a much better faction. They were not as iconic, they didn't do as cool things, but I think that fundamentally this is just a better group. Now, 2012 is when I would say that the renaissance of factions really began, with 2012 having the debut of The Shield, that being Seth Rollins, Dean Ambrose, and Roman Reigns. Granted, this is a very late 2012. They would debut at that year's Survivor Series at the end of 2012, but that little stretch alone in 2012 makes them the most memorable and the best faction of that year, because there was not that much competition before The Shield debuted. And they're going to be on this list again, but let's just point out the fact that this faction would go on to become absolutely legendary as a group and individually. We are looking at three trailblazers, three marquee tentpoles of professional wrestling today still. Dean Ambrose isn't even in WWE, and he's still one of the most important figures in professional wrestling today by being one of the figureheads of AEW. But yeah, factions were down bad in 2012, and the Shield towards the end of 2012 really came in and made the save. So shout out to the Shield for that. 2013 was a battle of two factions, quite literally, because they would go to war. And I ultimately ended up going with the faction that I feel had the better character work, and that was the Wyatt family. These guys were fantastic. Everything about what they did just knocked it out of the park in terms of character work. Bray Wyatt was fantastic. I love Luke Harper's dead eyes where you couldn't tell what was in there. I love the fact that Rowan was just this giant that didn't move and was stoic. This faction was also fantastic in the ring. They would put on banger matches. They had the whole world in their hand. Everyone wanted to know what Bray Wyatt and the Wyatt family was going to do next. And again, it could have been the Wyatt family or the Shield, but ultimately I felt like the Wyatt family was given the better storylines and the better character work through 2013. However, 2014 gave us the Shield right back. This is the year that the Shield truly cemented themselves as the top dogs in the WWE when they took out the Authority X Evolution as they reformed to form Evolution with Blue Batista. But I would say 2014 is when these guys became a lot more human, because before this, they kind of just seemed like these guns for hire that didn't have too much personality. But now we are seeing the more human side of these guys, the motivation behind them. In 2014 was a coming out year for not just the Shield, but all three of these guys. 2015, I ended up giving this to the Authority. Now, the Authority has actually been active for a couple years up to this point, and I think that there could have been a really strong case to give the Authority faction of the year for a couple of the previous years. But this is what I mean. Factions are starting to become relevant again in the WWE. It's not just a one-man show, or I guess I should say a one-team show, or a no-team show, how it's been in a couple of years. But the Authority, this is the year where they align themselves with Seth Rollins. This is the year that they would go into war with Roman Reigns. So they did a lot this year. But look, this isn't my favorite year of the Authority. I'd say my favorite year is probably like late 2014 when they were feuding with Team Cena and Sting came out. There's a lot of good stuff with the Authority, but 2015 Authority is also really good. The only problem was just how annoying the Big Show was in this group. Oh, I'm part of it. No, I'm not part of it. Oh my God, I'm gonna cry because I'm gonna lose my job unless I turn heel for the 17,000th time. 2016, we're kind of cheating here, and we're kind of cheating for the next couple of years because, look, I consider the New Day a faction. It's a group of three. I know that they're predominantly a tag team specialist group, but doesn't change the fact that it's more than two. More than two, to me, that's a faction. However, they didn't really operate under like a traditional faction because they would use the Freebird rule where any two of them would be able to participate in a tag team match, which is why they're more of a tag team than they are a faction. But hey, look, the New Day, it's a legendary group. This is a group that's going to be immediately day one inducted into the WWE Hall of Fame. I don't think that you guys are going to be mad if I include them in 2016 as well as 2017, because this was a legendary stretch for the New Day. These guys were so good. 2018 was the rise of the cool faction again, the cool heel faction that everyone wants to root for, even though they're the bad guys. Spoiler alert, though, they're not from the main roster. Do you know who they are yet? Okay, because I'm about to shock the system. It was Undisputed Era. It was always Undisputed Era. These guys were too good. So good. Their in-ring work was fantastic. Their character work was great. Adam Cole on the microphone was on another level. They were putting on banger after banger after banger in the main event of every single NXT takeover that they were a part of. And they were just freaking cool, dude. They were so cool, in fact, that they also, to me, were the best faction of 2019 as well. And I could make the case for them in 2020 if I really wanted to. But don't worry, it's just back-to-back years. The Undisputed Era, to me, is one of the biggest missed opportunities for the WWE main roster ever. Well, one, I just think that they took too long to eventually pull the trigger to utilize them and bring them up to the main roster, because they never pulled the trigger. And two, even if they pulled the trigger when they should have pulled the trigger, they would have screwed them up. Vince McMahon doesn't like white guys that are under 6'2" and under 250 pounds. He just doesn't like them. He doesn't book them very well. He would have destroyed this faction in the main roster. That's why we need to love and appreciate what we had with NXT Black and Gold and the Undisputed Era, because it was just beautiful and perfect, and it's never going to be replicated. 2020 was, of course, a tough year for all of us, and tough year for the WWE as well. However, it did give us a really cool faction that, of course, in classic WWE faction at this time, they would go on to ruin by disbanding them way too quickly. We're talking about the Hurt Business, led by MVP and, of course, Bobby Lashley and Cedric Alexander and Shelton Benjamin, two unsung heroes of the WWE lower mid-card, two guys that could consistently put on banger matches. We're finally getting an opportunity to be treated like main event caliber stars. Sure, they weren't the focal point of the group, Bobby Lashley was, but it was nice to see Bobby Lashley and MVP be able to rise two other guys who had absolute absolutely the talent and rise them to the main event scene of Monday Night Raw. But for some reason, they just pulled the trigger on the disbanding of the Hurt Business way too quickly. Everyone unanimously agrees that they had way more left. Had this been 2021, 2022, the Triple H era, shall we say, I really think that the Hurt Business could have been something special, especially because now factions are treated like gods at this point, and I think they were just a little bit too early for their time. But I love the Hurt Business. Again, I'm just heartbroken that they got disbanded as quickly as they did. 2021 saw the rise of the Tribal Chief Roman Reigns and the Bloodline. Sure, you're not surprised to hear that both 2021 and 2022 saw the Bloodline being the #1 faction and probably the best thing on WWE television as well, especially 2022, early 2023 Bloodline. God damn, you know, as the children say, that shit was cinema. That was one of the best stretches of WWE that I've seen in a really, really long time when it comes to storytelling. When they added Sami Zayn to the Bloodline, it fundamentally changed everything about this faction in the right direction. They were becoming stale towards the end of 2021, early 2022, and the addition of Sami Zayn really jolted this faction with a new lifeline and more fresh air. Sami Zayn kind of saved the Bloodline, honestly. And I think there's a strong argument to say that the Bloodline is the faction of the year in 2023 as well, because they were awesome together with Sami Zayn at the very start of the year, and, you know, even with Solo and the Usos and Roman Reigns being together without Sami Zayn. But ultimately, like, all of their breakups and the fact that they had this civil war, the Bloodline story was great in 2023, early 2023, I should say. But I don't think that they're the best faction of 2023 anymore. I would say that 2023 now has to go to the Judgment Day. I left JD McDonough out of this picture because I still refuse to believe that he's part of this group. But Judgment Day has rebuilt themselves from a faction in 2022 that was looking like they should disband. They weren't doing anything, to a faction that's now sitting at the very top of Monday Night Raw television and all of WWE. They're the top of the pecking order. And that just goes to show that WWE, and more importantly, Triple H, doesn't give up on factions. Like, he wants to make them work. And I think it's because he knows how great factions can be from his time in DX and his time in Evolution. So he gives them time to breathe. Even when they seem like they're getting stale, Triple H is just cooking up something up in the background. And there's no better example of this slow burn that ultimately led to something special than the Judgment Day. So that's it. I'm done. Get out of here.